December 1944. The Ardennes forest was silent, too silent for war. Snow lay thick on the ground, muffling every sound except the slow creak of pine and the breath of men trying not to freeze. The world seemed blind beneath the fog, but somewhere, in a small truck hidden beneath a tarp of white cloth, a faint green light pulsed in the dark. Inside, two American soldiers stared at a circular screen. A thin beam swept around it, again and again, like the heartbeat of something alive. This was no weapon, no gun. It was a machine called the SCR-584 radar, a strange invention the Germans had mocked as an engineer's toy. Yet in that truck, it was watching what no human eye could see. Suddenly, the blips appeared. Dozens of them, moving west, slow, then faster. The operator adjusted a dial, squinting at the glow. "They're moving toward us," he whispered. He called in coordinates. Moments later, the still forest erupted. American artillery thundered into the fog. Shells screamed overhead. Hidden German tanks, advancing unseen under cloud and snow, were torn apart before they even reached the front. No reconnaissance plane had seen them. No scout had reported them. Only that silent radar, a few volts of electricity and a turning dish, had betrayed their position. The Germans had counted on weather to hide them. They thought radar couldn't see through snow. They were wrong. By the end of that brutal winter, the SCR-584 would help decide the fate of the greatest battle fought by the U.S. Army, the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans had laughed at American radar. But laughter dies quickly when your enemy can see through the storm. 4 years before the Battle of the Bulge, radar was still a word few soldiers had ever heard. It existed in laboratories and workshops, in notebooks filled with equations, not on battlefields filled with smoke. When the war began in 1939, both sides had radar in theory. Britain had built its chain-home towers, massive steel frames along the coast that detected bombers crossing the channel. Germany had its own radar sets, the Würzburg and Freya, impressive for their day, but heavy, limited, and tied to fixed positions. In the United States, radar was still experimental. But something was about to change. In 1940, British scientists arrived in America carrying a secret: the cavity magnetron, a small metal tube that could generate powerful microwaves at extremely short wavelengths. It was the key to high-resolution radar, capable of seeing with astonishing clarity. The U.S. military immediately founded a new laboratory to develop it further. The Radiation Laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. There, under physicists like Ivan Getting, Luis Alvarez, and Robert Bascher, teams of engineers worked day and night, racing to build radar that was not only powerful, but mobile, something that could go to war. By 1943, their answer emerged: the SCR-584. It looked unremarkable: a large dish mounted on a rotating base, loaded onto a truck. But its abilities were revolutionary. Where older radars needed manual control, the SCR-584 could lock automatically onto moving targets. Where earlier systems were blind in bad weather, it used 10-centimeter microwaves that pierced fog, rain, and snow. And where others merely detected, this one could track, guiding anti-aircraft guns or measuring artillery shells in flight. It was, as one engineer called it, a machine that turned math into marksmanship. But when it reached Europe in 1944, most field commanders didn't quite understand it. The radar required trained operators, precise calibration, and electrical power, luxuries not always available near the front. So the sets were placed behind the lines, mostly for aircraft tracking and anti-air defense. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, German scientists followed their own radar research. Their Würzburg Riese sets were technically excellent, accurate to within tens of meters, but they were static, large, and expensive. The Germans built brilliance. The Americans built practicality. That difference in philosophy would decide more than anyone realized. By late 1944, the Allied advance across France had slowed. The Normandy landings had succeeded, Paris was liberated, but supply lines were stretched thin. American and British generals believed the Wehrmacht was broken. Germany can no longer mount a major offensive, declared an Allied intelligence report in early December. They were wrong. In the forests of Western Germany, Hitler was preparing his final gamble. His plan, Wacht am Rhein, was audacious. Attack through the Ardennes, drive west to seize Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force the Western powers to negotiate. He gathered his last reserves, 3 armies, 250,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and hid them beneath the cover of weather. Snow and fog would blind Allied aircraft. The winter itself would be his ally. On paper, it was genius. In reality, it was suicide disguised as strategy. Germany was running out of everything: fuel, trucks, tires, men. But Hitler believed willpower could replace logistics. The enemy relies on machines, he told his generals. We rely on spirit. He also believed that American radar was crude and unreliable. German intelligence dismissed the SCR-584 as inferior in range and precision. They saw it as an engineer's experiment, not a battlefield tool. They never imagined it would one day see through their fog, locate their tanks, and guide shells into their formations. In early December, as snow began to fall across Belgium, American radar units were repositioned. Some were stationed near Liège, others near Bastogne and Namur, supposedly quiet sectors of the front. Operators were told to expect enemy aircraft, not a ground assault. The men running those radar vans were not frontline soldiers. Most were barely out of college. Physicists, engineers, technicians trained to read waveforms, not dodge bullets. They lived inside metal trucks, sleeping beside humming generators and glowing screens. But when the German attack began, those same screens became lifelines. The fog that grounded Allied bombers made radar the only functioning set of eyes in the entire theater. Where the Germans saw only snow, the SCR-584 saw motion. Faint traces moving through the valleys, columns of armor crawling through the forest. Radar could not stop the offensive, but it could tell commanders where to aim. As the first reports came in, American artillery units began adjusting fire based on radar data, and suddenly the impossible happened. The fog no longer mattered. The Germans had bet their final victory on blindness. Instead, they had awakened the first army in history that could see without light. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the forest erupted. From the German lines came a rolling thunder. Thousands of guns firing in unison. Shells slammed into American positions from Monschau to Echternach. Trees shattered, snow and dirt exploded, telephone wires were torn apart. Then came the tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and armored half-tracks rumbling through the mist. Infantry followed, shouting, firing, advancing through fog so thick it swallowed them whole. The Allied front was caught sleeping. This sector, the Ardennes, had been considered a quiet zone, a place for tired divisions to rest. Many soldiers had never even fired a shot in combat before that morning. In hours, entire regiments collapsed. Towns like Clairvaux, Saint-Vith, and Losheim fell under the weight of the assault. Communications broke down. American commanders struggled to understand what was happening. Radios silent. Visibility near zero. The weather had done exactly what Hitler promised. It had blinded the most powerful army in the world. But not completely. Behind the front, in the scattered radar posts and signal trucks, something strange was happening. Operators staring at the green sweep of their screens began to notice moving echoes. Faint, rhythmic, pulsing returns from beyond the lines. At first they thought it was noise, snow interference, or a technical fault. Then the patterns grew stronger, consistent. They were watching movement, columns, armor. The operators adjusted their antennae, measuring the speed and bearing of the signals. They relayed the coordinates to artillery command posts. Within minutes, American howitzers opened fire through the fog. Blindly to the naked eye, but perfectly on target to the radar. One operator later said, "We could feel the shells leave the guns before we ever saw the flashes." It was the first time in history that radar had been used to guide artillery in a major ground battle. The German commanders couldn't understand it. They had counted on total surprise. Their tanks had advanced under cover of the storm, unseen, unheard, until they struck. Yet every time they massed for an assault, shells landed with impossible accuracy. They began to suspect that the Americans had some new form of intelligence, some invisible scout in the sky. They were right. But it wasn't in the sky. It was sitting quietly in a truck, humming in the snow. By December 19th, the German advance had driven a 50-mile bulge into the Allied line. At its center stood Bastogne, a small Belgian town where 7 roads met, the crossroads of the Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne could control the flow of the entire offensive. The Germans needed it. The Americans refused to give it up. Elements of the 101st Airborne Division, led by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, were rushed in to hold the town. They had almost no supplies, little ammunition, and no air support. For days, they fought surrounded, outnumbered 5-1. The weather trapped them as much as it protected them. No aircraft could fly. No reinforcements could arrive. But radar could still see. A few miles behind Bastogne, U.S. radar crews worked through freezing nights, tracking German artillery flashes and tank movements. Using radar's precise timing, they calculated enemy gun positions and fed the data to American batteries. Counter-battery fire followed within minutes. In the words of one artillery officer, "We were blind until they told us where to look." The siege of Bastogne became a battle of endurance and mathematics. The 101st Airborne fought in foxholes dug into frozen earth, surviving on meager rations. The radar operators fought in silence, their screens flickering through snow, their generators barely running on frozen fuel. Then came the famous moment. On December 22nd, German envoys approached under a white flag, demanding the American surrender. McAuliffe read the message, smiled, and wrote a one-word reply. Nuts! It was defiance, pure and unpolished. But behind that defiance stood something deeper, the knowledge that help was coming. Guided by something the Germans didn't believe existed, because while Bastogne held, General George S. Patton's Third Army was already on the move. Patton had turned his entire army north in a maneuver military historians still call miraculous. In just 2 days, he reoriented 3 divisions and pushed through snowbound roads toward Bastogne. His artillery and armor moved under constant coordination from radar-guided fire control. Even in fog, his guns struck with uncanny accuracy. On December 23rd, the clouds finally broke. The sun returned, and with it, the full force of Allied air power. What radar had sustained in darkness, air power now unleashed in daylight. Hundreds of fighters and bombers filled the sky, striking German convoys trapped on narrow roads. Supply lines burned. Bridges collapsed. The Luftwaffe tried to fight back, but their aircraft were too few, and Allied pilots now had radar-guided ground control directing them through the sky. The German offensive, once a roaring spearhead, began to fracture. North of Bastogne, near St. Vith, German armor fought desperately to hold its gains. There, too, radar-guided artillery made the difference. Every time a battery fired, radar tracked the shell's flight. corrected their aim, and refined their next salvo. Accuracy that once required visual spotting now came from mathematics and radio waves. A war that had begun with mud, smoke, and instinct was turning into one of circuits and precision. The German army had mastered blitzkrieg, the art of speed and shock. The American army, in this frozen forest, was mastering something new, the art of seeing without sight. For German tank crews, it felt like witchcraft. They would advance under perfect cover, no visibility, no aircraft above, and yet, somehow, the shells still found them. Fuel shortages worsened. The offensive slowed. The weather, once their ally, now became a coffin of cold. By Christmas Eve, the once confident 6th Panzer Army was stalled. Manteuffel's 5th Army, which had driven farthest, began to withdraw. The Ardennes was devouring them, one frozen mile at a time. On December 26th, Patton's tanks reached Bastogne. The siege was broken. The men of the 101st emerged from their foxholes, exhausted but alive. One soldier wrote in his diary, "The snow is red now, and we are still here." For Hitler, the last hope of the Western Front was gone. His armies retreated through the same valleys they had stormed, leaving behind burned-out armor and dead men buried beneath ice. The offensive that was meant to save the Reich had instead destroyed its last reserves. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest engagement ever fought by U.S. forces. More than 600,000 American troops took part. Nearly 90,000 became casualties, 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 missing or captured. For the Germans, losses were even higher. Over 100,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 1,600 aircraft destroyed. The Ardennes became a graveyard of steel. Towns like Houffalize and St. Vith were wiped from the map. Civilians froze in their homes or fled into the woods, and yet, in that frozen hell, a new era of warfare had begun. The SCR-584 radar had proven that machines could do what men could not: pierce darkness, measure chaos, bring precision to confusion. What began as a laboratory project at MIT had quietly become the difference between defeat and endurance. Hitler's last offensive had failed not just because of bravery or weather or supply, but because science had outthought him. The Germans had believed technology belonged to engineers. The Americans had learned it belonged to soldiers too. By January 8, 1945, the German army was in full retreat. The snow still fell, but now it covered wreckage: tanks, trucks, helmets, rifles. The fog that once hid them now shrouded their defeat. And through that fog, the radar beams still turned, sweeping the empty skies, searching for what was left of an enemy who could no longer laugh. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but its lessons were just beginning. When the guns finally fell silent in January 1945, the Ardennes looked less like a forest and more like the surface of the moon. Trees were stripped bare. The ground was cratered and black. Burned-out tanks leaned in ditches, half buried in snow. Beneath the drifts lay thousands of soldiers, German and American alike, frozen where they fell. The Battle of the Bulge had lasted 6 weeks. It was the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. And though it ended in victory, it was a victory paid for in blood, steel, and silence. The numbers told one story. The reality told another. American casualties reached 89,000. Of those, 19,000 were killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. German losses were even greater. At least 100,000 men, their last reserves of armor and fuel gone forever. But statistics could not measure the human toll. In places like Bastogne, survivors described the cold as the real enemy. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Men froze in their trenches. Medics worked without morphine. One soldier recalled, "We stopped feeling our hands days ago. You just load and fire, because stopping means dying." And when it was finally over, the relief that followed didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. The Battle of the Bulge had drained the last of Germany's strength. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive in the West. But it had also tested the Allies like nothing before. It proved that even the strongest army could be blindsided. That victory demanded not just bravery, but clarity. That clarity had come from a quiet, humming machine, the SCR-584 radar. In the official after-action reports, radar's contribution appeared only in a few technical lines. Radar-directed artillery proved highly effective under conditions of limited visibility. But those lines hid a revolution. Before the Ardennes, radar had been seen as an accessory, something for spotting planes or measuring distance. After it, it was recognized as a weapon of precision, a way to see when human senses failed. Army statistics later showed that radar-guided fire missions used 70% fewer shells to achieve the same result. In a campaign where every supply convoy was threatened, that efficiency saved lives. It also saved Bastogne. Had radar not tracked German movements through the fog, the artillery protecting the 101st Airborne would have been blind. Without that unseen guidance, Bastogne could have fallen. And with it, the entire center of the Allied line. But radar's success came with a strange consequence. Almost no one noticed. The soldiers who fired the guns were celebrated. The generals who planned the counterattack were immortalized. But the men who worked the radar vans, the mathematicians, the technicians, the quiet operators staring at green light in the cold, remained invisible. They didn't charge into battle or fire a rifle. They sat behind machines, adjusting knobs and frequencies. Their war was silent, but it was their silence that allowed others to fight. One operator wrote in his journal, "We saw the war as dots on a screen. When the dots disappeared, we knew someone had died. That was the other cost, the psychological one. Technology made the killing precise, but it also made it distant. The men who used radar learned to fight without seeing faces. It was efficient, it was effective, and it was unsettling. For the scientists who built it, the feeling was similar. Ivan Getting, who helped design the SCR-584 at MIT, later said, "We wanted to build something that could save lives. But in war, saving and destroying become the same act." That realization would haunt many who worked on wartime science. Radar had proven that knowledge could change the battlefield more than courage. But it also showed how easily invention could lose its innocence. When Allied commanders reviewed the battle in early 1945, they identified two decisive factors: the resilience of the American infantry and the technological edge of radar. Both had turned chaos into survival. The Battle of the Bulge was a victory of endurance, human and scientific. Men held their ground in the snow. Machines gave them sight in the dark. Together, they broke the last hope of the Reich. The cost was terrible, but the result was clear. After the Ardennes, Germany's fate was sealed. The Wehrmacht had lost its final gamble. The Allies had learned a new rule of war, that the future would belong to those who could see first. And in that frozen forest, for the first time in history, a machine had seen for man. When spring came to the Ardennes in 1945, the snow began to recede like a retreating tide. The ground underneath was no longer white, but gray and black. Soil mixed with ash, fragments of steel, splinters of trees. The war was still not over, but the last great German gamble had failed. The men who survived the winter packed their weapons, their frozen memories, and moved east toward the Rhine. Among them were the radar operators, the quiet ones. They dismantled their SCR-584 sets, cleaned the frost from the magnetrons, and loaded the trucks again. No medals waited for them, no parades. Their war had been invisible, their victory mathematical. But their invention had changed the battlefield forever. For centuries, battle had depended on sight. From archers on ancient walls to snipers in ruined cities, war had always been ruled by the eye. But in that winter of 1944, something fundamental shifted. Machines had learned to see. The SCR-584 radar was not merely a device. It was the first true extension of perception. It replaced instinct with calculation, visibility with detection. When men could no longer rely on daylight, it gave them another kind of vision. One measured in microseconds and waveforms. Military theorists would later call this the automation of awareness. It meant that the act of seeing, once a human sense, could now be engineered, standardized, and reproduced by machines. And that transformation, born in snow and fog, became the seed of a technological revolution. After the war, the scientists of the MIT Radiation Laboratory scattered into universities, government research agencies, and new industries. They carried with them the knowledge that electromagnetic waves could not only reveal the unseen, they could organize the world. Radar technology spread quickly. Civil aviation adopted it for air traffic control. Meteorologists used it to track storms. Navies built ship-borne radar to guard fleets against unseen enemies. But within the military, radar's role grew far beyond detection. It became the nervous system of an emerging idea: command and control. If radar could locate an enemy in real time, why not connect that information directly to the decision-makers, to artillery, to aircraft? Thus began the pursuit of a fully integrated battlefield where sensors fed computers and computers guided weapons. The chain that began with the SCR-584 would lead, within decades, to the SAGE early warning network, to NORAD's watch over the skies, and eventually to the digital grids that direct modern armies. By 1947, the Second World War had ended, but a new one had already begun. A war of vigilance. Radar, once a defensive tool, became the shield of an uneasy peace. Across the Arctic Circle, radar stations rose like silent sentinels, part of the distant early warning line, built to detect Soviet bombers long before they reached North America. The logic was the same as it had been in Belgium. Survival depended on seeing the threat first. The Cold War turned that logic into a doctrine. From radar came interception. From interception came deterrence. From deterrence came a balance of terror maintained by information. The machines that once guided artillery shells now guided missiles tipped with nuclear warheads. For the men who had built the first SCR-584s, the transformation was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. Many of them moved into peacetime research, contributing to television, computing, and aerospace navigation. Others joined defense projects that used radar as the backbone of global surveillance. The line between communication and control blurred. What had begun as a device to protect soldiers, from unseen attack evolved into the architecture of a world constantly watched, where invisibility became almost impossible. Technically, the SCR-584's design was simple: a parabolic dish, a servo-controlled antenna, and a network of vacuum tubes generating microwaves. But its principles became the foundation for everything that followed. The concept of feedback control, where a machine measures its own output and adjusts automatically, was perfected in this radar. That idea became central to modern automation, from missile guidance to computer programming. In the late 1940s, engineers like Claude Shannon, who also worked with wartime communications, used similar mathematical theories to define information itself. In his 1948 paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, Shannon quantified data in bits. the same units used in radar pulses. Information became measurable, transferable, and weaponizable. From radar beams to binary code, the connection was seamless. What began as a wartime necessity became the backbone of the information age. Every time a smartphone pings a satellite or an aircraft follows a GPS route, it is echoing the principles tested in those frozen forests of Belgium. But technological progress never travels alone. It carries a shadow. The moral question of how far we are willing to let machines act in our name. The scientists who created radar were not soldiers. They were physicists, radio engineers, mathematicians, men drawn from universities into a war they never expected to fight. When peace returned, many struggled to reconcile pride with discomfort. Luis Alvarez, who worked on microwave radar before moving to the Manhattan Project, once reflected, "We won because we learned to see farther, react faster. But we also built a world where no one could ever be unseen again." That was the paradox radar left behind. It promised security but created surveillance. It gave precision but demanded surrender of privacy. It saved cities but taught nations to watch endlessly for threats. In the forests of the Ardennes, radar had been salvation. In the decades that followed, it became obsession, the desire to see everything, everywhere, all the time. Yet for all its power, radar was never infallible. Machines see patterns. Humans see meaning. The operators who watched those early screens knew this instinctively. They learned to read the subtleties, the flicker of a signal that meant movement, the ghost echo that meant reflection from snow. Their judgment was what made the system effective. After the war, many of them returned home quietly, their names forgotten. Some became engineers, others teachers. But they carried with them the memory of what it felt like to fight through data, to know that lives depended on lines of light on a glass screen. That experience foreshadowed the modern battlefield, where soldiers sit at consoles thousands of miles away, guiding drones or analyzing satellite feeds. The distance between operator and impact, first felt in those radar vans, has now become the defining feature of 21st century warfare. The Battle of the Bulge proved that courage wasn't only measured by who charged forward, but also by who could stay still, who could sit in the cold, surrounded by darkness, and keep watching. The radar crews did exactly that. Their story rarely appears in history books, overshadowed by tanks and paratroopers. Yet they embodied a different kind of heroism. Intellectual, patient, disciplined, they fought not with bullets, but with clarity. It was their persistence that allowed commanders to act with precision. Their steadiness turned chaos into coordination. That form of heroism, quiet, technical, unseen, would become the hallmark of future conflicts. Behind every modern victory lies someone watching a screen, interpreting signals, making decisions that no one else will ever see. The legacy of radar stretched far beyond war. Its techniques led directly to advances in medicine, in imaging technologies like ultrasound and MRI. Its mathematical methods influenced civil engineering, meteorology, and even archaeology, where ground-penetrating radar now reveals buried cities. Every field that deals with waves, reflection, and detection owes something to that wartime breakthrough. But the most profound legacy was cultural. Radar changed how humanity thought about perception itself. Before radar, seeing was an act limited by light and distance. After radar, we understood that the universe was filled with signals waiting to be translated. We learned that everything, air, sea, even the human body, could speak in echoes if only we built the right instruments to listen. That shift, from visible to invisible, from eye to equation, reshaped the modern mind. By the 1950s, radar had become so common it was invisible again, taken for granted, like electricity or time. Airports buzzed with it, ships navigated by it, and television borrowed its frequencies. What had once been a military secret became a background hum of civilization. But in military command rooms, the lessons of the Bulge remained sacred. Commanders studied how information flow determined victory. War colleges taught that every decision begins with detection, that no strategy survives blindness. The SCR-584's descendants now circle the planet in satellites, tracking storms, planes, and people. Its principles govern missile defense systems, air traffic grids, and deep space telescopes. It watches the weather. It guards the borders. It peers into the cosmos. A device born in panic and war has become the instrument of global order. Today, radar's original function, detecting reflections of waves, has evolved into something far greater. Modern sensors don't just observe, they analyze. They interpret behavior, predict motion, even anticipate threat. In many ways, that's the truest descendant of the SCR-584, a system that once tracked a single moving dot and turned it into a decision. Now, artificial intelligence performs the same task at incomprehensible speed, reading patterns, assigning probabilities, guiding responses. But the philosophical question remains the same. Where does human judgment end and machine perception begin? The men in the Ardennes knew the answer instinctively. They understood that machines could show you the world, but they could not tell you what it meant. Meaning still belonged to the mind, to choice, to conscience. That awareness kept them human, even as their tools became superhuman. When historians describe the Allied victory, they often cite bravery, logistics, and leadership. But technology, particularly radar, gave those virtues a new edge. It wasn't brute force that saved Bastogne. It was precision. And precision, unlike courage, can be copied. That is radar's double-edged legacy. It leveled the battlefield intellectually. Once one nation possessed it, others had to follow. Soon, every major power had radar, then computers, then satellites. The race for perfect information became endless. We now live inside the world radar began, a world where every second is measured, every movement tracked, every threat anticipated before it acts. It is safer, perhaps, but never truly at peace, because the power to see everything also brings the fear of missing something. In the end, the story of the SCR-584 is not only about innovation, it's about humility. It reminds us that the tools we build to master uncertainty often end up mastering us. Those who laughed at it, who dismissed it as a gadget, were defeated not by firepower, but by foresight. Those who built it learned that knowledge can save lives, but also that knowledge carries responsibility. In that balance lies the essence of modern warfare and of modern civilization. When the snow finally melted from the Ardennes, the radars were packed away, their dishes rusting in depots, their operators discharged. But their echoes never stopped traveling. Every time a pilot lands safely in a storm, every time a satellite scans the Earth for danger, every time a signal bounces back from the dark and tells us where we are, it carries the faint heartbeat of those early beams sweeping through the winter fog of 1944. That hum, that pulse, that rhythm of knowing and responding, it is the sound of the modern age being born. The SCR-584 began as a weapon to see through cloud and snow. It ended as a vision that taught humanity something larger, that the future belongs not to those who shout the loudest or strike the hardest, but to those who can see the clearest. And so, the laughter that once mocked American radar has long since faded. What remains is the quiet truth that outlasts every empire. Precision endures. Ignorance does not.